Welcome, welcome. We're going to chat about things. Soliciting some questions from the chat, so I'm going to get straight to it. Stani, thank you very much. That was a really informative keynote. Cross-chain future for Aave, certainly very hype. Sheila, we're going to talk to you as well. Let me get some answers, Stani. I'm going to ask some questions from the chat. Just kind of take it in order, sort of. All right. So first of all, you mentioned sort of this cross-chain future. I guess let's go from the general to the complex. I'm going to start from some of the general questions that we got from the chat from viewers who are watching the keynote. First one, I think, is actually a good, simple question. How is Aave different from Compound in your view, Stani?
Yeah, I guess it's not just a question related to how Aave is different from something very close to what we have, but also like the other DeFi protocols that might kind of like serve a different kinds of functioning, because there's always differences in terms of features. I mean, feature-wise, Aave has collateral swaps there in the protocol, flash loans integrated as well. And we have a kind of like a different way of calculating yields, and also there's the stable borrowing rate as well, instead of like only variable rate. But like, I guess like for all of the DeFi protocols, essentially what they are communities that are assessing and selling risk to their kind of like risk and reward to their users. For example, the Aave community has a different kind of I would say the risk assessment framework, and also like way to manage risk compared to, for example, the Compound or MakerDAO's model, or any other protocol that is in DeFi. And that means essentially that the community comes together and votes on risk parameters on, let's say, what kind of asset could be listed, what kind of risk there could be. And that's essentially what differentiates every protocol from each other. And in terms of like Aave protocol, it has quite conservative risk parameters. So you can't draw liquidity against your collateral that high. You don't get that much of collateral out of the protocol. But at the same time, the community lists quite wide repertoire of new assets into the protocol. So that's the kind of like a difference, in my opinion, across DeFi.
Okay, cool. So I'm hearing a little bit about the onboarding process for new tokens. So I'm going to skip that question. Good question, Matthew B. Thank you very much. One question I did want to ask, you talked about sort of this multi-chain future and this idea of Aave everywhere, which is really interesting. What's your view of the Polkadot ecosystem at this point in time?
It's very interesting. Even like since I kind of like saw Polkadot first time and started reading and getting myself introduced on what they're building, there's so many components there. Like pretty much, of course, like what fascinates me is the ability to kind of like use like the main network and secure parachains, and you can spin up a parachain and kind of like have decentralization there to any kind of like extent is very fascinating, and what we are at Aave also kind of like researching. But also the ability to use different languages and then which is compiled into assembly and WebAssembly from technical perspective. That's very fascinating to us. I think the ecosystem isn't fully ripe yet, but I think once it's very ripe, I think it will be very interesting to the whole Aave community to deploy there something, or maybe there could be even like another party in the Aave community that can just focus on actually Polkadot, because it's a ecosystem that definitely will be thriving in the future. That's very interesting.
Definitely, yeah, definitely early days there for sure. All right, couple more questions, and then we'll get to the Zack and Sheila questions. All right, I got to ask this one from Chainlink God, Twitter legend Chainlink God. He wants to know, how important is Chainlink Price Feeds and Chainlink Keepers to the future of Aave?
Yeah, I mean, increasingly important. So every second that the more value that our protocol captures, not just on Ethereum layer 1, but for example in Polygon and elsewhere where Chainlink price feeds are used, and they're used pretty much everywhere where Aave is, that will be kind of like I would say even like a gate into data for the protocol itself and the whole DeFi ecosystem. And it also showcases like how not just like valuable the Chainlink is for Aave and rest of the DeFi, but how important and responsible role it's playing, and kind of like how important it is that as a DeFi community and Chainlink community is looking towards like not just kind of like a brainstorming the future of these price feeds, but also how all this risk management and everything is improved in the future because of the importance of Chainlink. So it pretty much touches all the assets that we have in the protocols. It's critical infrastructure, and that is something where we need to put more and more focus over time.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you for answering those questions from the chat. I want to zoom out a little bit because I think there's a lot of really interesting material that we can cover here. You mentioned, DeFi by some metrics is a $70 billion subsector of the crypto economy. Aave, obviously the leading platform at present. I want to talk about DeFi's next chapter. And I think we're hearing a lot about institutional DeFi in the market these days. You have an institutional product that you've been working on. I think it's called Ave Arc now. Are there any updates as to when that is going to ship?
Yeah, Ave Arc is fascinating product. So as currently the Aave market, of course, is now it's deployed. The protocol is deployed in Ethereum, Polygon, and we're looking into other networks. But also within Ethereum, we're experimenting with the Ave Arc part of the protocol, which is essentially a separate private market on top of Ethereum, which means that there's a whitelister in the market that can be in the multiple whitelister in the future, which the Aave governance chooses. And this whitelister can then whitelist and blacklist suppliers, borrowers, and liquidators within the protocol, meaning that you can create completely new market with additional requirements. And with the Arc market, actually, you can deploy them multiple, depending on what kind of requirements you want to have. But also, the first one is based on kind of like a compliance requirements that the whitelister wants to uphold for the users, meaning that essentially you can create a market that just has higher compliance requirements, meaning it's more institutional friendly, meaning that the institutions that otherwise have difficulties in participating in the kind of like permissionless DeFi, they can try the Aave Arc market and kind of like get used to the smart contract execution, have the same transparency that Ethereum as a public blockchain ledger provides, meaning that every transaction is auditable, seen every single second, every single block. And also you have, instead of paper transactioning, you have smart contract execution, so you can trust that the smart contracts executes as they're built, and also risk parameters set by the Aave governance. So essentially, it provides pretty much like a soft launch for institutions to use DeFi where they have higher risk appetite. But also it allows to spin up a new Aave Arc market for some other particular reason. Might not be compliance, but maybe you want to create a private market with some particular assets that are not listed in the main market and are special for some particular reason. So it's a very fascinating product.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk more about sort of these parallel tracks of DeFi in a second. I'm certainly guilty of this. I often talk about institutions as this monolithic sort of faceless mass. When we talk about institutions in the context of Ave Arc, who are we talking about? Who's going to be the first institution that really gets its hands dirty on these DeFi protocols? Who are you? When you say institutions, vaguely, like who are you referring to?
Yeah, the concept of institution is very, very wide, right? So as you know, Zack, and I think like for us in the first Aave Arc market, there's going to be Fireblocks, Galaxy Digital, and a few other Fireblock clients. So it's going to be starting very small in the beginning, just to kind of like build up the liquidity. But also we're talking at the same time to the biggest banks globally and smaller private banks as well. So there's a lot of interest out there. Of course, like the thing is that we can't fit all of these like interested entities into the same Aave Arc market, because everyone has their different kinds of like compliance requirements or other requirements in terms of like counterparties, might not be compliance reasons at all. And that is why the future kind of will be that there will be this kind of like Aave Arc markets, this kind of like a pods and you will have a few counterparties between different, depending on the requirements. And probably the first Ave Arc market will be the most scaled one, essentially, and especially as we add more as a community, the whitelisters there. And I think that's the kind of like institutional scale, but mainly it will be targeted to kind of like a bigger funds and hedge funds, and over time maybe the banks and the Coinbases of the world. But it will start slowly.
Okay, that really primes the pump for Sheila, so thank you for doing that. Sheila, I think this is a really fascinating question, this idea of sort of regulated DeFi or more regulated DeFi or whitelisted DeFi or KYC DeFi. From the folks that you talk to sort of in the orbit of the World Economic Forum, is that something that's appealing? Or are people nervous about that? What is sort of the conversation? What's the pulse check when it comes to institutional DeFi here at this point in time?
Yeah, well, thanks, Zach. As with anything, it depends on who you ask. You know, there are a variety and multitude of opinions. I think there is definitely a feeling that there's something about DeFi that is going to necessitate regulation. I think the views on the timing of regulation are highly divergent. I think some people think that, oh, we should just take everything we already know, you know, take KYC, port these things directly over into DeFi. It's not a view that I agree with at all. I think that regulation at this point is pretty premature because we're still at a really pretty early stage of the innovation arc. And so any regulation really risks cutting off innovation that I actually think could accomplish some of the goals these regulators are trying to achieve, namely consumer protection, fraud prevention, you know, financial inclusion, et cetera. If you regulate something before you really understand it, before it's had a chance to shape itself, then what you're really doing is pushing it into a particular model that may or may not achieve the ends that policymakers are trying to achieve in the first place. So that's my personal view, but certainly views on this differ. And there are, as we see, there are regulators who are very eager to get in there and start shaping this space and kind of make it into a mold that I do think more resembles traditional financial institutions than I think most of us would like to see or think is appropriate.
Yeah, so how do you shape that conversation? Because I think like when we talk about regulating DeFi, it really is sort of like square peg, round hole. A lot of these frameworks don't work in DeFi, and we're seeing that in conversations with the FATF and all sorts of regulatory conversations happening both in the US and abroad. So this is still with you, Sheila. How should we advance that conversation with regulators that, hey, we might need to rethink when it comes to some of these decentralized lending platforms?
Yeah, well, my personal view, you know, and the kind of approach that we're taking with the team here at the forum is to do a lot of education to really try to encourage, to say that it's not enough to kind of understand the applications, the services being provided here, because again, our minds can only often tend to sort of put things into boxes we understand, you know, so you think about, credit, and you have an understanding of how credit markets work. And then you assume that, any kind of new credit opportunity is going to mimic essentially those offerings without necessarily being able to imagine or fathom what other things might look like. And so we try to encourage that technical understanding is really important, and understanding not just theoretically what decentralized finance and the protocols can do, but actually what's actually happening and what the growth curve is really looking like. Not the growth curve in terms of dollar value or market cap or any of that, but the technology growth, like what's really scaling here and what the opportunities could be. And I think that as with the early days of the internet, and I think we're in a similar time, you know, there was a real concern at, you know, however many years ago, 20 years ago, you know, that there was going to be this, again, I call it premature regulation that was going to cut off innovation. So we try to really spotlight that this is a space that is operating. It's not the Wild West that people are making it out to be. In some cases, the media or others who might have an agenda. It really is a space that is growing and emerging and has principles underlying it. And those principles really are to provide a more democratized access and more inclusion into financial services, essentially. So we try to do a lot of that. I think we also try to, generally speaking, leaving aside even crypto or blockchain, just talk about regulation as a general frame and say, is it the case that our regulatory models are going to translate into what we call the fourth industrial revolution? Like as these new convergent technologies, I'm talking AI, you know, increasing use of smart devices, mobility considerations, like all these things come into play and start intersecting. Should we expect that our regulatory systems and the models that were built under a very different understanding of the way the world operates, a very different understanding of the digital economy, in many cases before the digital economy, Should we expect them to just kind of flop over into this new world? I don't think that we should. So what are some new ways we can encourage collaboration between industry, the private sector, public sector? You know, we can get the more of these conversations happening. We facilitate a number of these behind the scenes, connecting people. And what are ways that we can open up our models of regulation to ensure that the principles as a society we care about, some of the ones I mentioned, right, protecting vulnerable populations, more enhanced inclusion, equity, how can we make sure we're baking these into new regulatory models that are forward thinking in terms of the direction of travel with these various technologies?
So be my boots on the ground, and I'm going to ask for a 1 to 10, a scale of 1 to 10 on the level of sophistication and nuance when it comes to the questions that you're being asked about DeFi right now. Where are we? Are these questions savvy? Are we at the one end of the spectrum where it's like real basic, really silly? Are we at the 10 end of the spectrum where people understand the promise and potential of these technologies? Just give me that rating. Where would you say we are?
I mean, when you asked me that, Zach, I literally pictured a 1 to 10 number line, and I can plot a person on 1 to 10.
Well, you're free to name names. You're absolutely free to name names.
It widely varies, right? I think the more that policymakers understand the need to have some technical understanding, the closer they are to the 10. You know, and those who are really just kind of looking at the media and looking at, you know, what's kind of being reported or maybe on Twitter or whatnot, it's really more towards the 1. But I will say, and I think it's important to note that a lot of policymakers are really trying. They really are trying to understand. They are trying to get up to space very quickly get up to speed rather very quickly in a space that is extraordinarily complicated. And I wouldn't even say that a lot of pundits that are crypto pundits deeply understand DeFi, right? Like they might have some other thing they understand really well, but this is a challenging space. There's a lot going on. So I do want to give credit where credit is due to those that are really making an effort to try to get out there, have a lot of conversations, read a lot of, you know, of more sophisticated kind of offerings and get to an understanding.
Fantastic. All right, Stani, I'm jumping back to you. I think this idea of democratizing financial access often means going through sort of mainstream gatekeepers. And, you know, Uniswap let slip the other week that they had been talking to PayPal and Robinhood and E-Trade as these traditional fintechs look to incorporate DeFi in some capacity to their suite of services. Who are you talking to on that front? You don't have to name names, but if you do, that's great. When it comes to the conversations with the world of traditional fintech, who is Aave talking to about some of the things that DeFi can offer their user bases?
Yeah, I think we have, I mean, Aave has a lot of exposure because of the fact that how big it is today as a protocol. I mean, Aave is the biggest protocol now, and it's cross-chain, meaning that it also kind of like taps into audience that isn't necessarily in the main Ethereum network. And we actually have, as a protocol, more users in Polygon, which is a proof of stake network, twice as many. So it definitely like reaches out in a wider kind of like a demographic. But also, I would say, like, in terms of like, we don't have especially any kind of like a say like an outreach to financial institutions or traditional market participants. There's a lot of inquiries and more of like a education that we do, and we have discussions with probably the biggest banks and investment banks and also like consumer banks as well. We do a lot of discussions with fintechs, custodians, pretty much like almost every big household, fintech we have been talking to, and the major banks one way or another. So even like as a small team, and kind of like what we want more is not just like, you know, these entities being able to reach Aave and learn more about the Aave protocol, but also like having more on, like, I would say like a entities where these entities could reach upon and just like learn more from the community. So basically, like what we will want to see is more like a community run entities that are trying to educate more traditional financial institutions. And I think that's the kind of like a missing part, because there isn't that much of a value if financial institutions are reaching out to Aave and thinking like how they can learn more. but more of like understanding the whole space in general, and also understanding the community aspect and the sentiment there. But especially with the Aave Arc market, there has been more and more interest there. And I think for me, what's important is that two things is well understood. One is the properties of decentralized finance, because decentralized finance for me is important because it brings inclusivity, in the sense that if you use these protocols, you can use them globally with similar kind of like an access and to the markets, but also that you can access them and you see the transparency. Each and every transaction, everything is auditable every second, compared to banking systems that are kind of like a black box in terms of markets. And being able to also build new things and iterate quickly and build innovation is very interesting. For example, from the perspective of RegTech, smart contracts are very powerful, because not only you see everything, all the transaction, you can build better risk management tools, but also you can trust that the smart contracts execute the way they're programmed. Because in paper agreements, you can agree upon many things, but the execution might lack for one or another reason. So that's the one thing. And the second thing is the community ownership. So many of the institutions, they actually understand that the protocols are owned by their communities, meaning that they are making decisions. And there isn't like a central party or anyone kind of like there making the decisions. And secondly, that they understand that by providing liquidity, you get also as a user that community power and participation. So those are the things that have been well communicated, and I think are powerful.
So I'll ask this of both of you, and I'll start with Stani, because I'm interested in your perspective on this one. If I were to, posit the thesis that these protocols will sync to the background behind various abstraction layers that people will use Aave without knowing they're using Aave, is that thesis smart or dumb? Do you think that's going to happen, or do you think that Aave, Compound, Uniswap, these will be the big brands of the future of finance?
I think the protocols will always run in the background, and they will be governed by the community, and probably over time, as the protocols will be evolving, maybe they will be even renamed depending on like what kind of functionalities. But as a brands, I would say Aave as a team is just a Web3 development entity which aims to just build part of the Web3 until there's more and more people building. And what it means for us is that as we're building decentralized finance, our next thing, and this kind of like a financial graph, our next thing to build now, where we have allocated a lot of resources, is to build a social graph, and kind of like a social media type of a protocol where kind of like we're moving towards one thing, building to another, and completely different, because we see blockchain as a store of value, meaning that you cannot just store like, let's say, monetary value or any kind of value, but you can also store relationships linking to art, or what we have, for example, with NFTs. And I think like the brand will stick on Aave being able to build secure protocols, which is important, and have this kind of like a composability. But also like essentially those protocols will run by themselves the same way as Ethereum is running by itself and governed by the validators. In Aave's case, it's the users and the community.
Sheila, what's your view of whether DeFi will sort of sync to the background? And the question is, this is still used by a fairly small subset of the world population. There are potential benefits to a wide subset of the global population. What's your view in terms of how DeFi will be used should it approach mainstream level adoption?
Yeah, well, I think you asked a number of different questions there, Zach, so I'll kind of tease them apart a little bit. And so one is, the extent to which DeFi is going to become a phenomenon that is commonplace. I think, yes, I do think that is very dependent, of course, on the way it is regulated and on the enabling environment, that surrounds it. And so with that caveat, I think that yes, and my hope is that yes, we'll move in that direction. In terms of whether the protocols will become brand names, I think, or sink into the background or whatnot, I think it's both. And I also think it's too soon to tell. It's going to depend a lot on decisions that, Stani and Leshner and Hayden and others make. Right now, if you think about the current moment, is really honing in on building and perfecting the infrastructure with applications on top of it as well, then you can kind of imagine that there's going to be a suite of services that really start to thrive and take off, which is already slowly starting to happen. But you're going to see more emphasis on that kind of thing. Teams that are more product kind of oriented, doing that kind of thing. Who's going to do that? I mean, you're talking to somebody on our panel, right, who's got the foresight to probably understand that's going to happen with Aave, and others are going to know and make decisions there as well. It's going to depend on the extent to which these protocols, the companies that are working with the protocols, of course, which are distinctions that are important to make, are focusing on protocol maintenance or whether they're focusing on building this giant suite of services. And I am certainly not the person that could predict that. So that's why I kind of say it's both and a bit too soon to tell.
Gotcha. So Stani, as someone in the belly of the beast, what's the next big DeFi milestone that you are looking for that signals to you that DeFi has taken that next step?
I think the Ave Arc market kind of like working as designed and creating maybe kind of like inspiring institutions to kind of like look at decentralized finance as a software could actually be very good software to replace or be part of the software stack that we have now in other places in finance. I don't think the protocols are anything like businesses or anything like that. They're pretty much software, what I see. And if we are able to use this more efficient software, which is governed by their users and not companies that are building, that will be like a more fair, democratic way actually of governing something which is very important, which is financial infrastructure. So that's like one thing which is I'm looking forward to.
Got it. And so Sheila, what's the milestone that that you're looking toward, to signal that that next step in the evolution of DeFi?
Yeah, I was trying to remember, Zach, the last time you asked me that question, what I said, and I don't remember, but I imagine it was the same answer.
I should have dug it up. I should have dug it up and just put you on the spot.
I don't remember, but I'll tell you what I'm going to say now, which is I think some kind of clarity around the direction of regulation. This remains one of the biggest challenges, I think, to growth in the space and to the amount of energy people are going to put into it. And so once I think this has died down a bit and there's a little less, let's call it less regulatory turbulence, I think then we're going to really see that everything take off, and we're going to be more confident, I think, as a community that we can really deep dive and start pushing a lot of the things we all want to do forward.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to wrap it there. Thanks so much, Stani, for the keynote and the additional thoughts. Thank you so much, Sheila, for conversing with us here. This has been great. Thanks to the folks in the chat for participating and suggesting some really great questions as well. I'm Zack Seward from CoinDesk. I'm going to toss it back to Andy. Hope everyone's having a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you to our presenters. Hey, thanks, Zach, for coming on. Really appreciate your insightful questions. Pulling from the audience, we appreciate that.